The first sign of trouble wasn't a warning, it was an absence. At precisely 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the automated sprinklers across Fairhaven Estates failed to hiss to life. Not a single drop. HOA President Veronica Sterling, a woman whose life was a meticulously scheduled symphony of control, jolted awake not to the familiar rhythmic spray against her window, but to a profound, unsettling silence. She raced to her lawn, a meticulously manicured masterpiece of Kentucky bluegrass, and jabbed a finger into the dry earth. Bone dry. She checked her phone, finding a dozen panicked texts from neighbors. The water was off. Not a broken pipe. Not a scheduled outage. It was a complete, deliberate, and terrifying silence. And the only thing between her lush, thirsty lawn and a perfectly good water main was a dilapidated 10-acre plot of forgotten land owned by a man no one in Fairhaven had ever met. A quiet, unassuming man named Elias Vance, who had refused to sell. The silence that fell over Fairhaven Estates was more than a mere lack of noise. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality crumbling. For Veronica Sterling, the HOA president, this was an existential crisis. Her life was an edifice of precision, built on a foundation of control and public image. Her day began at 5 a.m. with a brisk 3-mile jog on the community's pristine, winding trails, followed by a meticulously timed shower and a breakfast of steel-cut oats and freshly squeezed orange juice. Her professional life, as a respected real estate mogul, was a mirror of her personal one. Every detail was planned, every variable accounted for. She saw the world as a problem to be solved, a challenge to be overcome, and Fairhaven Estates was her magnum opus, her crowning achievement in a career defined by turning potential into profit. The community, with its identical, immaculately painted homes, its perfectly manicured lawns, and its unwritten code of quiet, suburban perfection, was a testament to her unyielding will. She had built this paradise with her own hands, or at least with the hands of a dozen architects, landscapers, and contractors she had personally overseen. Fairhaven was not just a development. It was an extension of herself. And now, her perfect world was under attack. The silence, a profound and unsettling absence of the rhythmic hiss of sprinklers, was a crack in her flawless facade. She stood on her lawn, her hands on her hips, her perfectly tailored linen suit a stark contrast to the burgeoning chaos around her. Her phone, a lifeline to her meticulously organized world, buzzed relentlessly with a dozen panicked texts from her neighbors, all asking the same question. Where is the water? Veronica, a woman who always had an answer, had nothing. She could only stare across the street at the source of her professional and personal downfall, the Vance property. This wasn't a home. It was an accusation. 10 acres of wild, unkempt land, a riot of weeds and gnarled oak trees, dominated the northern border of Fairhaven. In the center of it all sat a crumbling 2-story farmhouse, a monument to a past that the community had worked tirelessly to erase. It was the last remaining vestige of the original farmstead that had once occupied this entire valley, a forgotten history that Veronica, and every resident of Fairhaven, found deeply offensive. The property was an eyesore, a blight on their collective perfection. But it was more than that. It was an obstacle. Veronica had a vision, a grand, meticulously planned vision of a new community park, a state-of-the-art tennis court, and an additional loop of jogging trails that would elevate Fairhaven from a luxury community to a veritable utopia. And the Vance property, the final, crucial piece of land she needed, stood squarely in the way. For months, Veronica's campaign to acquire the land had been a masterclass in bureaucratic pressure. She had started with polite offers, then escalating to aggressive letters detailing all the ways the property violated obscure community guidelines, a campaign of psychological warfare designed to wear down the owner. The owner, Elias Vance, a man who had purchased the property with cash and a quiet, almost unsettling nonchalance, had met every offer with a simple, unwavering refusal. He was an enigma. He rarely left his property, and when he did, it was in a beaten-up pickup truck that looked a decade older than the community's newest landscaping equipment. He wasn't aggressive or even angry. He was just there, a silent, immovable wall against Veronica's relentless tide. The day he had moved in, she had personally greeted him with a welcome basket of artisanal cheeses and a thinly veiled offer to buy the land. Elias had accepted the basket with a soft, genuine smile, but his rejection of her offer was firm and final. "This land has a history," he had said, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, holding hers for a moment. "And I'm here to honor it." The morning after the water failed, Veronica's veneer of calm control shattered. She called an emergency HOA meeting, her voice trembling with a fury she had never before allowed to surface. The community center, a monument to their collective success, was packed. The air buzzed with frantic energy, a low hum of paranoia and speculation. People's lawns, their cherished symbols of status and perfection, were already beginning to yellow. The vibrant, meticulously pruned rose bushes were drooping. The crisis was no longer abstract. It was a physical, tangible threat to their way of life. The meeting room, with its pristine white walls and perfectly aligned chairs, felt like a cage. Veronica stood before them, a towering figure of authority, but even she couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. "This is not a coincidence," she declared, her voice echoing in the silent room. "The water for our entire community is sourced from the valley's main aquifer. Our infrastructure, our pumps, our pipes, they're all fed from a single line that runs directly beneath the Vance property. And now, the water is off. It is no coincidence." A collective gasp swept through the room. A hand shot up from the back, belonging to a man named Gerald, an elderly retired engineer who rarely spoke. He was a man of quiet logic, a man who saw the world in terms of systems and facts, not emotion and innuendo. "That's impossible, Veronica. Our legal documents, our city permits, they all state that the water rights for this land were permanently relinquished when the original farmstead was sold decades ago. It's the whole reason Fairhaven Estates was even possible. Our water is guaranteed." Veronica's face tightened, her perfect smile cracking. "That's what we were led to believe, Gerald. But our lawyers are looking into it now. There are ambiguities, legal complexities from 100 years ago that are tied to the original land deed. We don't have all the information yet, but what we do know is this. The only person who benefits from this is Elias Vance. And he is the only person who has the ability to stop our water flow, which he has now done." Her words were a masterstroke of manipulation. She was not just blaming Elias. She was painting him as a villain, a saboteur, a man who had held their entire community hostage for his own personal gain. She was turning a legal and infrastructural issue into a personal vendetta, and the crowd, desperate for a villain, bought it hook, line, and sinker. The frantic energy in the room transformed into a righteous, unified fury. They saw their own dying lawns reflected in her rage, and they mirrored it with a vengeance. Meanwhile, on the Vance property, Elias was oblivious to the chaos. He was not a villain. He was a scientist, a hydrologist, to be precise, with a deep, abiding respect for the earth and its hidden systems. He was a man of quiet, almost unsettling intelligence, a man who saw the world not in terms of property lines and social status, but in terms of ecosystems and interconnected resources. He was not a newcomer. He was a descendant. The Vance property, which had been in his family for generations, was a legacy of his grandfather, a man who had fought a similar battle decades ago and had lost. But before he lost, he had left behind a meticulously detailed journal, a record of the original legal documents, the original water rights, and a complex map of a system of ancient, underground pipes. Elias, armed with his grandfather's journal, had spent the past 3 months meticulously mapping out the old water system. He had discovered a well-concealed underground valve, a rusted but still functional relic from a century ago, that controlled the flow of water to the entire valley. The original developers of Fairhaven Estates, in their zeal to build a luxury community, had, in a stunning act of arrogance and negligence, built their entire water infrastructure on a foundation of a single, easily controllable valve. They had assumed that the Vance family would eventually sell, or that the old legal documents would simply be lost to time. They had been wrong. The grand twist in this story was not that Elias was a villain. The twist was that he wasn't a newcomer at all. He had been sent here, not by a whim, but by a destiny. His grandfather's dying wish, the final entry in his journal, was for someone, one day, to come back and right the wrongs of the past, to reclaim the land, to honor the water, and to, if necessary, turn off the water and force the community to see the true cost of their reckless, unsustainable way of life. The slap was not a crime. It was a lesson, and Elias Vance, a quiet, unassuming man with a brilliant mind and a deep, abiding respect for his family's legacy, was about to become the most important teacher the community had ever known. He was not, however, just a silent, methodical scientist. He was also a man with a profound sense of justice. He was not just acting on his grandfather's wishes. He was acting on a deep-seated belief that a community built on a foundation of greed and negligence could not and should not stand. The water was not just a resource. It was a symbol of their collective entitlement, their collective ignorance, their collective refusal to see the true cost of their perfect green lawns. And Elias Vance, with a single deliberate turn of a rusted, century-old valve, had just forced them to face it. The silence was not a punishment. It was a beginning of a new, difficult, and profoundly necessary conversation. The weight of an eyesore was about to become the weight of a conscience. The story was just beginning. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns had just begun, and they were all about to find out, in the most painful way possible, that the truth, like water, could not be contained. The silence over Fairhaven Estates became a living, breathing entity, a character in its own right, tormenting the residents with the visual evidence of their escalating crisis. The perfect, verdant lawns, once symbols of status and wealth, were now becoming canvases of a slow, agonizing death. Blades of grass curled into yellowed, brittle wisps, crunching underfoot with a dry, mournful sound. The prized rose bushes in Veronica Sterling's front yard, the very bushes she had cultivated with meticulous care, now drooped like wilting flags of surrender, their once vibrant red petals turning to a dull, sickly brown. The air, once filled with the sweet, damp scent of freshly watered earth, now carried the dry, dusty tang of a desert, a constant reminder of their newfound vulnerability. The initial fury in the community center was now a panicked, desperate chorus of complaints and accusations, all directed at Veronica. The chess master, who had always had a move for every contingency, found herself in a position she had never anticipated, a game without a board. Veronica, however, was not one to surrender. She had spent a lifetime building her reputation, her authority, and her community. She would not allow an unassuming man and a forgotten piece of land to bring it all down. She had publicly blamed Elias Vance, but a part of her, a small, terrified voice in the back of her mind, knew there was something more. Elias wasn't a saboteur. He was a ghost. He had no social media, no public footprint, no history. He had simply appeared, and with his appearance, their water had vanished. It was an impossible riddle, a mystery that defied her meticulously organized world. Her perfect, manicured life was becoming an unraveling tapestry, and she was pulling at every thread, frantic to find a solution. She hired a team of private contractors, a group of burly men in work boots and hard hats, to investigate the Fairhaven water system. These weren't the community's usual gardeners. They were seasoned professionals who specialized in complex infrastructure. They spent days meticulously mapping every pipe, every pump, every line. They checked for leaks, for blockages, for anything that could explain the sudden, complete cessation of water flow. They found nothing. The system was perfectly functional. The pumps were running, the pressure was stable, the lines were clear. The only thing missing was the water itself. It was a terrifying, almost supernatural puzzle, a mystery that seemed to mock their very expertise. The men, who had seen it all, left with a baffled defeat, their faces a mixture of frustration and confusion. Meanwhile, on the Vance property, Elias was a man in his element. He was a scientist, not a saboteur. He saw the world in terms of systems, of cause and effect, of interconnectedness. He spent his days not in a frantic state of retaliation, but in a quiet, methodical process of discovery and restoration. He wasn't just living on the land. He was becoming a part of it. He spent his mornings walking the property, a detailed map from his grandfather's journal in hand, mapping out the old, hidden network of pipes. He wasn't looking for a weapon. He was looking for a legacy. He was looking for the truth. His grandfather's journal, a leather-bound book with a faded, embossed V on the cover, was more than just a historical document. It was a warning, a prophecy, and a guide. The journal detailed the original legal documents from the 1920s, a time when water was a commodity, not a given. The original deed to the Vance property, which encompassed the entire valley at the time, contained a crucial, almost unbelievable clause. The owner of the Vance property held the primary and exclusive rights to the valley's main aquifer. All other properties, all other water systems, were dependent on a single, easily controllable valve. When the original farmstead was broken up and sold, the developers of Fairhaven Estates, in their haste to build a luxury community, had simply ignored the clause, assuming it would never be a problem. They had built their entire utopia on a foundation of legal negligence and historical amnesia. The journal also contained a second, more sinister twist. The original developers of Fairhaven Estates, a group of powerful, ambitious men, had known about the legal loophole. They hadn't ignored it. They had actively tried to conceal it. They had created a second set of legal documents, a fake deed that stated the water rights were permanently relinquished. The fake deed had been filed in an obscure local office, a quiet, almost conspiratorial act of historical revisionism. The original deed, the true deed, was hidden in a secret compartment in the old farmhouse, a final, desperate act of defiance from Elias's grandfather. The journal contained the coordinates, the exact location of the hidden deed. The water wasn't just off, it was a statement. A statement that the truth, no matter how buried, would eventually find its way to the surface. The community's frustration, once directed at Elias, now turned inward. The contractor's failure to find a solution, the constant refrain of "the system is perfectly fine," started to fuel a different kind of speculation. People began to question Veronica's authority. Her carefully constructed facade of competence began to crumble. Community meetings, once a forum for her to disseminate her grand vision, were now a chaotic, angry mess of accusations and blame. A small, but growing faction of residents began to quietly investigate the history of Fairhaven on their own. They started digging through old town records, dusty archives, and forgotten documents. The thirst for water had become a thirst for truth, and they were beginning to suspect that Veronica's narrative, the simple story of a villainous neighbor, was a lie. The twist was not just in the past. It was also in the present. Elias, with the help of a brilliant and equally quiet legal team, had just finished the final phase of his plan. He had secured the original deed from its hiding place, and with it, he had filed a new, irrefutable legal document with the state. He was not just a property owner. He was the owner of the water. He held the primary and exclusive rights to the valley's main aquifer, and he had the legal right to control its flow. The water was not just off, it was a statement. A statement that the past, no matter how buried, would eventually find its way to the surface. And Elias Vance, a man who had been a ghost, was about to become the most powerful man in the valley. The water was off, but the story was just beginning. The thirst for water had become a thirst for truth, and in the quiet, unassuming silence of the Fairhaven Valley, the truth was beginning to rise to the surface, a slow, unstoppable tide that would eventually wash away the entire community's foundation of lies and negligence. The weight of an eyesore was about to become the weight of a conscience. The story was just beginning. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns had just begun, and they were all about to find out, in the most painful way possible, that the truth, like water, could not be contained. The tension in Fairhaven Estates was a palpable, suffocating force. The manicured lawns, once symbols of status, were now monuments to a growing crisis. As the days stretched into a second week without water, The community's initial panic began to curdle into a seething, resentful fury. The contractors, after days of fruitless searching, had packed up their equipment and left, their faces a mixture of frustration and baffled defeat. The pumps, the pipes, the entire infrastructure was sound. The problem was not with the flow of the water. It was with the source. The residents of Fairhaven, once a unified, unthinking monolith of suburban perfection, were now a community of whispers, of secrets, of growing distrust. Veronica Sterling, a woman whose entire identity was built on a foundation of control, was now a captain on a sinking ship. Her authority, once unquestioned, was now a fragile, brittle thing. At the next emergency HOA meeting, held in a community center that smelled faintly of dust and despair, the whispers were no longer quiet. They were a low, angry roar. A man named Gerald, the retired engineer, stood up, his face a mask of profound disappointment. "We've had 3 different teams of experts in here, Veronica. They all say the same thing. There's no problem with our system. The water is simply not coming from the source. The question isn't what's wrong with our pipes. The question is who controls the source." Veronica's perfect smile cracked completely. She had hoped to keep the legal ambiguities a secret for as long as possible, to frame Elias as a simple, malicious saboteur. But Gerald, in his simple, logical way, had just blown a hole in her entire narrative. "I've been in contact with our legal team," she said, her voice a brittle, high-pitched sound. "There are historical complexities. The original deeds from the 1920s are vague. We believe Mr. Vance is attempting to leverage a legal loophole to extort us." The word extort hung in the air, a desperate, final attempt to frame Elias as a villain. But the crowd, thirsty for water and hungry for truth, wasn't buying it. A new voice emerged from the back of the room, a woman named Sarah, a quiet, unassuming lawyer who had just moved into the community. She was a woman who saw the world not in terms of status and property lines, but in terms of justice and equity. "There are no ambiguities, Veronica," she said, her voice calm and steady. "The original deed is a matter of public record. I've been doing some research. The deed to the Vance property contains a clear, unambiguous clause. The owner of that land holds the primary water rights to the valley's aquifer. This is an extortion. It's a legal fact. You've known this for days, Veronica. You've been trying to cover it up." The room erupted. The fury, once directed at Elias, was now focused entirely on Veronica. The truth, like water, had just broken through the surface, a slow, unstoppable tide of reckoning. Veronica, her face pale with a mix of fear and fury, was a cornered animal. "This is not over," she snarled, her perfect mask finally cracking, revealing the raw, desperate ambition beneath. "I will not let one man and one forgotten piece of land destroy this community. We will fight this in court. We will rezone his land. We will take the water by force if we have to." Meanwhile, Elias, on his wild, unkempt land, was oblivious to the chaos he had unleashed. He was not a villain. He was a builder. He had secured the water rights. But his plan was not to hoard the water. It was to use it to create something new, something better, something sustainable. He had spent his days meticulously restoring the old, forgotten well on his property, using modern technology to bring it back to life. He was building his own independent, sustainable water system, a system that would not just provide water for his land, but would also serve as a model for a new, more responsible way of life. The old, rusty pipes were being replaced with new, efficient ones. The old, forgotten well was now a source of clean, pure water. The weight of an eyesore was about to become the weight of a conscience. The story was just beginning, but the legal battle was just getting started. The next day, a small but growing faction of residents, led by Sarah, filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, demanding Veronica's resignation. Veronica, in turn, filed a formal lawsuit against Elias, a legal siege of frivolous claims, all designed to bleed him dry and force him to surrender the water rights. She hired a team of high-powered, ruthless lawyers, men who saw the law not as a tool for justice, but as a weapon for the powerful. She was no longer fighting for a community. She was fighting for her own reputation, her own power, her own control. The twist in this section was not just in the revelation of the truth, but in the psychological shift of the characters. Veronica, a woman who had always been a master of control, was now losing it. Elias, a man who had always been a master of quiet solitude, was now being forced into the spotlight. And the community of Fairhaven, once a unified, unthinking monolith, was now a divided, chaotic, and profoundly human place. The legal siege was not just a battle for water. It was a battle for the soul of the community. A battle between a past built on greed and negligence, and a future built on truth and sustainability. And in the quiet, unassuming silence of the Fairhaven Valley, the truth was beginning to rise to the surface, a slow, unstoppable tide that would eventually wash away the entire community's foundation of lies and negligence. The weight of an eyesore was about to become the weight of a conscience. The story was just beginning. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns had just begun. And they were all about to find out, in the most painful way possible, that the truth, like water, could not be contained. The legal siege Veronica had launched against Elias was a masterclass in aggressive, unprincipled litigation. Her team of high-powered lawyers filed a flurry of motions and injunctions, all designed to delay Elias's project and bleed him dry with legal fees. Veronica, a woman who had lost her authority but not her ambition, was no longer fighting for a community. She was fighting for a reputation she had already lost. She was an unhinged, desperate figure, a captain on a sinking ship, still screaming orders even as the water began to close over the deck. Elias, however, was not intimidated. He had Sarah, the quiet but brilliant lawyer from Fairhaven, in his corner. She was his legal shield, a beacon of justice in the dark, murky world of Veronica's legal siege. She saw through Veronica's frivolous claims, her desperate attempts to delay and intimidate. She fought back with a quiet, methodical ferocity, a legal chess player to Veronica's desperate, flailing brawler. She was not just fighting for Elias. She was fighting for the soul of Fairhaven, for a new, more just and equitable way of life. The twist, however, was not in the legal battle. It was in the physical one. Veronica, a woman who had lost her mind but not her ambition, took a darker, more sinister turn. She was no longer content with winning in court. She was desperate to win at any cost. In a fit of paranoid rage, she went to a dark web forum, a hidden corner of the internet where the disenfranchised and the desperate went to find solutions to their problems. She found a group of men, a small, anonymous network of self-proclaimed digital mercenaries who specialized in a new, terrifying kind of sabotage. They were not plumbers or engineers. They were hackers, and they offered her a solution to her problem, a solution that would not just stop Elias's water system, but would destroy it. Her plan was a chillingly modern twist on an old-fashioned crime. The hackers, for a hefty fee, would use a sophisticated piece of malware to take control of Elias's new, independent water system. They would corrupt the code, overload the pumps, and, in a final, terrifying act of sabotage, cause a catastrophic mechanical failure that would not just destroy the system, but would also contaminate the aquifer itself. The water, the very source of life in the valley, would be poisoned. Veronica, a woman who had once fought for the perfection of lawn, was now willing to destroy the very foundation of her community for her own personal revenge. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was now a moment of profound, terrible clarity. It was a reminder that the greatest stories are not the ones we write. They're the ones we live. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns had just begun. And they were all about to find out, in the most painful way possible, that the truth, like water, could not be contained. Elias, with the help of Sarah, the quiet but brilliant lawyer from Fairhaven, was not just a man fighting for his land. He was a man fighting for his life. He had a profound respect for the earth and its hidden systems. He had a deep, abiding respect for the truth. He was a man who had, with a single deliberate turn of a rusted, century-old valve, forced an entire community to face its own history, its own negligence, its own greed. And now, he was faced with a new, terrifying challenge. A challenge that was not about a legal battle, but about a moral one. He had to save not just his land, but his community. He had to save not just his water system, but his soul. The final, motivational turn began here. Elias, a man who had always been a master of quiet solitude, was now a man of action. He was a man who had, with a single, desperate slap, become a symbol of strength and resilience. He was a survivor who had turned his pain into a purpose, his trauma into a triumph, his gilded cage into a powerful, compassionate movement. The slap, a moment of viral infamy, was now a moment of profound, terrible clarity. It was a reminder that the greatest stories are not the ones we write. They are the ones we live. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns had just begun. And a new, unexpected chapter for a woman who had found her purpose in the ghost of a legend was about to begin. The climax of the story was not a fight, but a discovery, a quiet, methodical unmasking that was far more devastating than any physical confrontation could ever be. Elias, a man of systems and logic, was meticulously monitoring his new, independent water system with a sophisticated network of sensors he had installed himself. He wasn't just checking for leaks. He was looking for patterns, for anomalies in the data stream. He found one, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the system's core operating code, a ghost in the machine that was attempting to corrupt the pumps from the inside out. It was a digital fingerprint of malicious intent, a modern-day act of sabotage aimed not at a person, but at an ecosystem. With the help of Sarah, the brilliant lawyer from Fairhaven who had become his legal and moral compass, they traced the digital footprint of the attack. They followed a twisted path from the malware to its source on a dark web forum, and from there, with a chillingly simple chain of evidence, to Veronica Sterling's personal computer. The private legal battle was no longer just a civil dispute over land rights. It was a criminal case. The battle for water had become a battle for justice, and Veronica's meticulously constructed world of control was about to come crashing down. The arrest was a quiet affair, a sharp and final crack in the facade of Fairhaven's perfection. 2 police officers arrived at Veronica's pristine home just as the sun was setting, their cars' flashing lights casting a lurid, surreal glow on the now browning lawn. She was led away in handcuffs, a woman whose entire identity was built on a foundation of unyielding control, now completely powerless. Her neighbors, once her loyal subjects, watched from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and a quiet, uncomfortable shame. The story, which had begun with a slap, was now ending with a profound, terrible clarity. The greatest stories are not the ones we write. They're the ones we live. The immediate fallout for Veronica was swift and absolute. The legal community, once so eager to represent her, now scrambled to distance themselves. Her partners at the real estate firm swiftly moved to oust her, her reputation becoming a toxic liability overnight. The lawsuits from the Fairhaven residents, who had lost thousands of dollars in property value and endured weeks of hardship, became a deluge. Veronica, the woman who had once stood on a pedestal of power, was now a public pariah, her perfect life a cautionary tale for the entire city. She lost everything: her career, her reputation, and her freedom. Her gilded cage of a life, so perfectly constructed and maintained, was finally dismantled. But the story's true end was not Veronica's downfall. It was Fairhaven's rebirth. Elias, with the full backing of Sarah and a growing faction of residents who had been awakened to the truth, used his legal rights not as a weapon, but as a tool for change. He held the power to control the valley's water, but he had no desire to hoard it. Instead, he proposed a new vision, a radical departure from the old HOA model. He called a final, critical meeting, not in the sterile community center, but on his own property, the 10 acres that had once been the source of so much resentment. The residents arrived cautiously, their faces a mix of curiosity and lingering distrust. Elias stood on a small rise, the setting sun casting a warm glow over his unkempt land. He held a simple, leather-bound book in his hands, his grandfather's journal. He explained the history of the land, the original water rights, and the negligence of the developers who had built Fairhaven on a foundation of lies. He didn't speak with anger or triumph, but with the quiet, reasoned voice of a teacher. He told them he had purchased the land not to be a villain, but to be a guardian. He then unveiled his proposal. He would, in fact, sell the water rights back to the community, but not to an authoritarian HOA. He proposed the formation of a new entity, the Fairhaven Valley Water Cooperative. This cooperative would be owned and operated by the residents themselves, with a constitution based on principles of sustainability, shared responsibility, and collaboration. The old, corrupt HOA was officially dissolved, and a new, democratic body was formed, with Elias and Sarah at the helm as temporary stewards. The old eyesore of the Vance property was to become the heart of the new community. Elias revealed a detailed plan for its transformation. The crumbling farmhouse, a symbol of the past, would be restored and turned into an educational center, where residents could learn about the valley's hydrology, the importance of water conservation, and sustainable farming. The surrounding 10 acres would be rewilded and turned into a nature reserve, with community gardens, a shared fruit orchard, and walking paths that would connect to the Fairhaven streets. The sprinklers, once a symbol of wasted resources and entitlement, would be replaced with a new, state-of-the-art drip irrigation system, a smart, efficient network controlled by the cooperative and powered by Elias's restored well. It would be a system designed not for extravagant, perfect lawns, but for the life-giving necessity of a truly shared resource. The residents, once apathetic and complacent, were now engaged. They saw not a punishment, but an opportunity. Gerald, the retired engineer, was one of the first to join the new cooperative, offering his expertise to help build and maintain the new system. Sarah, the quiet lawyer, found her voice and her purpose, becoming a powerful advocate for the cooperative's new legal framework. The residents who had once been so obsessed with their lawns were now getting their hands dirty in the community gardens, learning about soil health and water conservation. The crisis had stripped away their layers of pretense and forced them to find a more authentic way of life. The story was not just about a fight. It was about a new dawn of a community that had, in its moment of greatest crisis, found its greatest strength. A new dawn of a man who had, in his moment of greatest solitude, found his greatest purpose. A new dawn of a woman who had, in her moment of greatest despair, found her greatest hope. The HOA's attempt to rezone his land and their subsequent thirst for water had become the catalyst for a profound, terrible clarity. It was a reminder that the greatest stories are not the ones we write. They are the ones we live. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns had all led to a better, stronger, more authentic community, a place where a dilapidated, 10-acre plot of forgotten land was not an eyesore, but the very foundation of a new and beautiful future.